Welcome to the Courage to Be podcast with Tanya Vasallo. Before we get into this episode, I want to share with you that I'm on a mission to close the gender gap in the podcasting world so that more and more women's voices are heard. If you feel that this is something you value too, then please rate, review, and share the podcast. And in exchange, and as my way to say thank you to you, I want to give you free access to my signature course called Manifesting Abundance, which typically sells for $997. All you have to do to gain access is leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, take a snapshot of it, and send it to help.thecouragetobe@gmail.com, and we'll get you set up with access to the course. Welcome back to the Courage to Be, where we have powerful conversations to transform your life and your business. And today we have Gina Gallaun with us. Welcome, Gina.
Thank you, Tanya.
I'd love for you, for those of you that are listening and not watching on YouTube, you have to see Gina's energy. I wanted to have her on the podcast because I could, from the first video that I saw of you, I was like, oh my God, her energy, her smile, just her presence. Share with us, Gina, a little bit of your background, where you're from, what kind of work you do, and yeah, take us through your journey.
Okay, well, I'm Gina. I'm German. That's my accent. So today you have two Europeans on the podcast. I grew up in Germany. I left Germany when I was 20. I lived in Spain a little bit, in Los Angeles a little bit. I moved to Estonia, which is Scandinavia. It's very cold in the winter. And there I did my first thing that felt actually really, really brave in my life, that felt very risky at or in my early 20s, which was that I had this job offer, which would have been the perfect next step up on my career ladder. And I had been working so hard on having an impressive resume. I had this job offer and I tried this thing my friend invited me to. She called it a listening prayer. So it's the idea that you invite some wisdom, into your decision making. And I was like, sure, let's try it. And the idea is you present an idea to God, the divine, and just ask a question and see what thoughts come back to you. I mean, who knows? I might have been making this up, but it was a very interesting thing that happened. I said, hey, I have this job offer. I'm going to take it because it's the next best step. So I'm going to do that unless you have any other thoughts. Like I said it like this. And then we both closed our eyes. And I just had this thought hit me, take a customer support job instead, which for Germans, at least, I don't know what that's like in Spain, but it's not a very highly regarded role. It's kind of what you do, like call center jobs. If you don't really know where you're going next, you do that for a while. And I remember going back in my chair, what? That doesn't make sense, right? And then I was like, why would that make sense? And I had this other thought that, hey, you're really kind of a slave to your resume and you care so much about being at a party and saying something impressive, to that question, what do you do? And I just knew that that was true. And so I went back and forth a little bit. And then I decided to actually follow this crazy thought that who knows where it came from, maybe I made it up. And I took this call center job, which then turned out to be part of a tiny Estonian startup that at that point had only 50 employees, but that would grow into Estonia's big success story. Over the 8 years that I ended up being there, it grew from 50 employees to 2,500 employees, and from a few thousand customers to millions and millions and millions of customers, because we solved such a relevant problem about sending money internationally. It was called WISE. But so I did that for 8 years. I did this crazy startup journey, got to learn so much. It was the coolest job ever. And then after 8 years, I noticed inside that my main reason for continuing to stay there, even though there were still many great opportunities, was the fear that I would never find anything like that again. So my main motivation to stay was a fear. And when I checked in with what I really wanted, what would it be like you to do if you were not worried right now, about the future? I was like, what I would really love to do is go on a world trip and interview women from around the world on what courage has looked like in their lives, because I was feeling kind of uninspired for the next chapter. I didn't really have a good vision. I just didn't feel energy or, inspiration. And I know that the number one thing that inspires me is to speak to women and hear how did they navigate maybe a fear or a challenge with like personal style, personal courage, that gives me so much energy and inspiration for my life. So I ended up actually quitting my job and doing this trip and interviewing women and collecting so many inspiring stories that I decided to put them in like a book journal. And right now, what I'm doing right now is kind of sharing those stories just to spread the inspiration. So that's why I'm here, because I can't believe you've built this beautiful podcast that's all about courage. I mean, that's perfect.
I love when the synchronicities happen like that, that we both are on that journey. There's so many people, like if you do think about it, that we do get inspired by courageous stories, right? But I want to rewind a little bit with your own courageous journey and saying yes to this customer service job. And, even though your rational part of your brain's like, no, don't do that. That's not like the right thing. And then following your intuition, like that, you got an intuitive hit there. Was that the first time that you can identify that you got some type of intuition and you followed that and overrode the rational and logical part of the brain?
Yeah, I would say so because I mean, I had done things that look brave maybe earlier, like, as an 18-year-old moving to Los Angeles or moving to Spain, moving to Estonia. To some people, that looks really courageous, but I didn't have to like work through some sort of maybe objection or anything that was holding me back. That was just like what I wanted to do, and it was easy for me to do. But this situation in my early 20s with deciding to take a job that doesn't look good on the outside, and I even spoke to a recruiter who said, "You're going to ruin your resume if you take this call center job." And, my parents were obviously worried. So there were so many like rational arguments against it that I had to work with and see what do I want to do, because it really felt like on the one hand there were rational arguments, on the other hand there was this idea that felt very true to me. I don't know if that makes sense. Like I had to work through something and I had to trust like this voice more than the rational arguments. And it really took something. I feel like it was the first like really brave thing I did.
That's amazing. And just that distinction too of noticing that to some people, what might not feel a need to be as brave or as courageous, like moving, for someone else, that might be a huge fear to overcome. And that's a big act of courage. But to you, it seemed different. It was just like, okay, it is an act of courage, but it's not as big as this other one that carried a fear, of like, what does it look like? And how are people going to judge me? And all these other
Yeah.
things. But then you learn to listen to that. You got rewarded. I always say the universe favors the brave, right? And so you got rewarded with 8 incredible years. And then once again, your internal voice, your higher self was speaking to you and you decided to quit your job and go travel and interview all these women. How long was it? A full year that you were traveling? And where did you go? And what did you discover along the way?
Oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start. Well, I want to start with the last question that you asked. What did I discover along the way? It is so fascinating how courage really means that there's some sort of fear, right, that I'm feeling, and I have to find a way through it. So I interviewed this one woman who said, "Hey, I've done brave things. I've moved abroad. I have taken a career that's actually quite risky. But you know what? None of those things, I didn't have big fears around them that I had to work through. They really weren't that brave for me. But you know what takes the most courage of me," she said, "is that when there is a day where I'm just so overwhelmed, there's so much going on in my personal life, at work, and I'm just not in a good place. And I know deep down, like the brave thing to do, like what I really need today is to take a day off, literally sit on the couch, watch Hallmark all day, just give myself a break. That would be the brave thing to do. But that to me is the scariest thing to do, to step away from everything for a day. That's what takes me the most courage. And so just seeing how courage, you can't just say that, quitting your job is brave. No, like what's brave is when you have a fear and you, instead of just acting based on that fear, you listen to it and then you talk with it and you think about it and you figure out, okay, what's really important to me? Like listen to your intuition or your values, and then you find a way with personal style through the fear. That's brave. That's something I learned. And another thing I learned interviewing these women is that even though circumstances look very different, the themes of courage that we have to develop or practice are actually the same. I interviewed this woman from India, and she said, the most courageous thing for me was to say no to an arranged marriage and, marry the man that I had met that I really loved. And I was like, okay, so why is that courageous? Is it because, you're pissing off your parents, or like, why is that brave? And she said, no, no, what happens is if you marry a man, like all my girlfriends, they married a man that the parents chose, right? And then it is inevitable. I mean, it will happen that you'll have some sort of marriage problems, like every couple has them. When your first marriage problems arise, you can blame your parents. You can call your parents and complain. You can tell your girlfriends that that was a bad choice, right? And so the scary thing is, I made my own choice. So that meant like the first time we got into a fight that I didn't know how to resolve, I could not call my parents. I couldn't blame anybody. Like that was my choice. And so to take ownership like over my decisions, that is scary and that is brave, and I thought, oh my gosh, like even though I've never been faced with the idea of an arranged marriage, I know exactly what that feels like, the courage to take ownership over my decisions.
This is fascinating. Let's distill that a little bit more. Did you encounter any other stories with other women of just like what you're saying? Like we might not be going through arranged marriage, but we can put ourselves in the shoes of that particular person and say, wow, yeah, that was a hard decision and taking ownership because I never really thought of it from that perspective. It's like the moment you do something courageous, you do have to take ownership from it because you took action and you really can't blame anyone else if it fails. But you also get to take all the rewards of the success because you chose that and no one forced you to do that too. So you are responsible for the positive and the negative, right?
Yes.
So what other things that you noticed with the trip,
I
and just meeting other people, other women?
The first one that comes to mind that I'm just going to go ahead and share is Flavia's story from Brazil. Her story is about when she was a little girl. She had this dream that all she wanted from life really was a great job, a beautiful house, and a beautiful marriage. That was her dream. And then by the time she was 40, she had a beautiful house, she had an amazing job, and she had been a bridesmaid at like, it was over 20 weddings, but had never been a bride herself. And, this was her dream. Like you and I might have completely different dreams. But the thing that was brave was that on her 40th birthday, she said, oh my gosh, like this dream that I've had is not happening. And she took the courage to ask her friends this open ended question. She asked her friends, how might I be contributing to this? Or how might I be blocking my own dream from coming true? And then that's scary, to do. And then she got this feedback that, hey, you're a bit of a control freak, which works so great for you in your job. And in romantic relationships, less great, And then she really took the work. She joined like a mastermind group to work on that and got herself a tattoo that says let it go on her wrist. And so she did the work, and now she's 44 and she's been married for 2 years now. And she told me that story that now, when her and her husband are going out and he's running late, that's a situation in the past where she would have felt like frustrated and she would have tried to go in, make him hurry up, get there on time. And now she says, now I boil myself some water, I make myself a tea, I sit down in the kitchen, and I kind of think about like letting it go. And I just thought that it doesn't matter what our dream is, to be married, to build a business or have kids, I don't know, whatever it is. But if we notice for a significant amount of time that dream is not materializing, to ask like, how might I be blocking this miracle, this dream from coming true? Again, that takes a lot of courage.
That's amazing. I love hearing these other stories that you've been compiling too, because we're coming from different directions. I've done it through the podcast, you've done it through your own interviews with them. Let's take a quick pause and we'll be right back. Hi there, I have something really cool for you. I want to give you free access to my signature course called Manifesting Abundance, which typically sells for $997. You can check out all the details in the show notes. All you have to do to gain access is leave me a review on Apple Podcast, take a snapshot of it, and send it to help.thecouragetobe@gmail.com, and we'll get you set up with access to the course. You can also find other free goodies in the show notes. Go check them out. So Gina, let's dive deeper into your intuition. So you had these two big courageous moments. Obviously, there were other smaller moments of courage, but to you might have not signified, as big of a courageous leap, because you had to jump and hold on to faith. Tell me about how you've developed your intuitive side and listening to the hits that come to you when you have to take these big leaps, and obstacles might show up, fears might show up. Tell me about how you connect to your intuition. Do you listen to it differently after all these different moments that you've had of confirmation of yeah, just be brave, do it, and then you'll be rewarded in some way? How do you connect with that intuitive side?
I have to give credit to someone. His name is Jim Wilder, and he's a neurotheologian. And he has written some interesting work that I came across in my 20s. And one concept that he talks about is this idea of fear bonds versus love bonds. And the example is like a fear bond would be if I do something or I say something because I'm afraid if I don't, like, how will you, Tanya, respond? Or I don't say something because I'm worried about how you might respond. That's a fear bond. And then a love bond is because I say something to you, even though maybe there's a risk it might upset you, but I trust that we can figure it out, because I want to say it, I say it. And when I came across this idea, I realized, like in my mid 20s at some point, that even though I've done things that look brave, it's actually crazy how much of my life is still fear motivated. Like how much of my maybe relationships, I behave in ways that I really do things or I don't do things out of fear of how the other person would respond, and even in business too. And that was a huge game changer for me to start looking at, okay, am I doing this out of fear? Or, is there a desire that's driving this? And I feel like somehow being aware of this difference has really helped me connect to my intuition and start hearing that voice. I don't know exactly why, but I guess that maybe our intuition usually wouldn't be driving us into a direction of fear, and that was where my brain was going so much that maybe it was hard for me to hear or notice my intuition before I even opened up and tried to build these new pathways of, okay, well, what would it be like me to do if I wasn't afraid? Like, what would I do then? Does that make sense?
Yes. Can you give us a more tangible example, like with a story or something that just showed up, and the fear was there, the fear bond, and you're like, you know what? No, it's very scary to have this conversation, but I'm gonna shift.
You know what? Okay, I'm going to give you a very private example. It's just the first one that came to mind with my stepkids. So, as part of this world trip, I actually ended up moving across the world, and now I have a blended family. That's a different story. But I hadn't had my own kids, and I hadn't really had friends with kids. Uh, so I didn't have much experience with kids. So I marry this man, like the love of my life, and I become a stepmom. And I joined this family. And this family, my husband, the two kids, how they had always done bad times specifically is that my husband reads something to them. So to all three of them, the idea of bedtime is the parent reads a story to the kid. That's what it is. So that's their expectation towards me, right? And I mean, I care about being a good stepmom. And I noticed in the beginning, especially, like it was so overwhelming for me to like be in a parent position. I mean, there was so much I had to learn about kids that I didn't know, that by the time bedtime came around, like my battery was at like 2%, to be honest. And like the last thing I wanted to do was to read a book. Like that took more than the 2% I had left. Like it's not even my own language. And I just did not enjoy that at all. And so I actually found myself trying to avoid bedtime in sneaky ways. I was trying to like get my husband. I was like, hey, my friends, they take turns doing bedtime. So you only have to do it every other day. Like, how about that? But he's like, no, I want to say goodnight to them every night. So, that didn't work out, me trying to like reduce my bedtime. And then I came up with these ideas that I said, hey, if you're not in bed by this exact time, I'm not reading to you anymore, like set some strict boundaries, which then left them disappointed and then also wasn't satisfying for me either. And I did this whole bedtime dread for like a year. And then I realized, wait a minute, like this is a fear thing. Like I think I have to do bedtime the way they expect me to because I'm afraid otherwise they will think maybe my like family-in-law would think I'm not a good stepmom, right? It's like a fear thing, but it's not going well at all. It's not building relationship. It's like not creating peace, none of the good stuff. And then I asked myself, okay, so what would it be like me to do if I wasn't worried about what my family thinks of me? And that, enabled me to even think creatively for the first time. And so now I actually love bedtime and I don't have to read anything. And now, what I do with my stepdaughter, I do this happy place exercise where we imagine being in a happy place and how does it feel? What do we hear? And we invite, a person that we trust to give us like a message of love before we go to bed. And her imagination is amazing. Like it gives me so much energy to do that with her, to share what we heard. I love it. And this is building relationship and it's inspiring. And oh, but it took me like over a year.
I love this, Gina. Thank you so much for sharing because that's been one of our things. And for me as a mom, I don't know if it's a European thing versus an American thing because I did not grow up with parents reading to me in
Me
bed. Like
neither.
the only person I remember reading to me as a kid was my aunt. And it was at summertime and she'd read to me and my cousins and we'd all pile up in the bed and she enjoyed and got energy out of it, like what you're
Yeah.
saying, So I almost feel like it's a cultural thing, that here in the US, it's like you better read to your kids or your kids are going to be, damaged and they will not like books or whatever the stories that there are that we're telling ourselves. So I
Yeah.
love that you shared this story because I can so identify with it because by nighttime, my battery is also at 2%. You
Seriously.
just explained it so beautifully. And I'm so thankful that my husband steps in because he has more energy. And so he connects with my daughter in a different way. And he does read with her and I connect with her. I'm more alive in the morning. I'm the morning
Yeah.
person. So let's do something in the morning. But did you share your fear about this of just like that you weren't, beside after you overcame the sneakiness and coming up with other things, your subconscious mind and realizing, did you have that conversation with your stepdaughter or with your husband, of like, ooh, I just realized I've been doing this and I'm scared of not being a good stepmom, or how did that all unfold?
Yeah. I did share with my stepkids, and they were just like, oh, okay, well, we like what we're doing now, So it was, yeah, there wasn't much response there. And I talked with my husband a little bit, and he would always encourage me to find my own way to do it. So honestly, I think it's more me taking a step back and really doing it, and because he can't tell me what it is like me to do. All he knows is what works for him. So I shared, but I really took away it's on me. If I'm really unsatisfied with something, I need to take in, yeah, instead of complaining, it's so much easier to complain. I need to take some time away and figure out what to do.
That's great. Thank you for that. And so going deeper into intuition, how do you connect with your intuition now? Like you've been developing it, you now know that if you do get the message that you should act on it because there will be rewards. What do you do these days? Do you meditate? Do you journal? Like, how do you connect with your intuition?
Personally, I love journaling. Meditating, I am still working on it. I get distracted so easily, especially if I do it at home and I see like the laundry in the corner or something. Oh, even if I go to my prettiest room, I notice that the plants have to get watered. So meditating is still hard for me, but journaling, I only look at that page, and I have certain journaling techniques that really work for me, work the best for me. I feel like I still have a way to go to figure this out. But yeah, journaling is my favorite right now.
And you get answers while you journal?
Yes, I do. I do. I have this very interesting journaling technique if you want to hear about it.
Yes,
Um,
please.
I think it can be controversial, but I'm going to explain why I think it works. So that journaling technique is actually kind of faith-based. So it works with the assumption that you're talking to a divine, like to God or a divine source. And you start by just like a little bit of appreciation. It could be just one point of appreciation where you talk to God and you say, God, thank you for this. And the idea, really, the science behind it is that if we get into a place of gratitude, our brain opens up in ways, right? So it's like to prepare your brain. And then the next paragraph is to think about a response from God to you. Like, let's say I would have written, dear God, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation with Tanya today. It was so interesting, connecting with her. And then I would take a moment with the prompt, like, dear daughter, what might God say? Like, maybe God might say, like, I love that you two connected. That was so much fun to see. I don't know, right? Like, whatever comes to your mind. And then the next part is assuming that if there's a God, that God is witnessing what you're going through. So the prompt is to say, I see you, like I see you sitting at your desk, maybe kind of hunched over, and I hear you like worrying about, the meeting in the afternoon. And I hear you saying these thoughts to yourself. And then it goes like, hey, I'm glad to be in this. So it's that assumption that if there is a divine, if there's a God, that God is like love and is happy to be with you in this situation. So then write about that a little bit, even though you don't know how the meeting's gonna go, I know like the future, I know I have a good plan for you. I don't know, something like this. And then basically there's prompts like that. Why I think it's controversial is because we don't know if there is a God. Like it's impossible to know. And to me, it's just as likely that I'm making these things up or that there is a God. Like to me, it's a 50-50. Like I can't know. But for me, consistently, this journaling leads to some really, really, really helpful insights. So even though I've at this point given up on figuring out is there a God or not, like I practice it, I kind of assume there's this divine source that I can talk to because whether it's true or not, I just get so much out of it. Like, yeah.
This is beautiful. And deep down, who cares, right? Like if,
Yeah.
like you said, I think the question is not does God exist or this, higher intelligence or spirit or source or however you want to call it. Maybe it's your higher self, but that's the divine, that's the mystery part, of life, right? That we don't know, but obviously you're getting something out of it. Has there been any stories like lately or that you come to mind that as you were prompting yourself or that you were worried with something like this? To me, what it reminds me of, and thank you so much for sharing that, Gina, because you never know who's listening that this might work for them. That's why I always like asking my guests, like what kind of rituals do we all use? What kind of things do we do? What are our practices? Because what might work for you might not work for someone else, or what might work for you is inspiring someone else to try it out. And they're like, oh my God, I never even knew about this. And this is amazing. And here you are inspiring and impacting someone's life with this. To me, it reminds me of that book, Conversations with God by Neil Donald
Oh,
Walsh. Have you
I
read
actually
that
haven't read
book?
that. No. Okay,
Oh my
interesting.
God, yes. He has a whole compilation of them. I'm looking up at my shelf to see if I have it there, but I don't think I have it here. And it's similar. That whole book is written in that way. It's like it's a conversation with God, like in his eyes, it's he is talking with God. So it's like, dear God, I'm seeing blah, blah, blah. And then it's God's response. And anyone that's agnostic or doesn't believe, could be like, oh, well, that's just his subconscious mind answering. And yes, it could be, but who cares? Like
Yeah.
from a psychology point of view or from a scientist point of view, like it's just, they could be saying, well, that's just his subconscious. That's just this, or that's just something else. But I think if it works for you, try it, why not? And you're giving me ideas. I journal differently. I do just stream of thought and ideas come to me, but I'd love to prompt it like this, like try this exercise and see what shows up for me. So thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that.
Yeah.
Any stories that have shown up for you, Gina?
Oh man. Yeah, I don't have one coming to mind. Like, oh well, okay, so one thing that comes to mind is actually right now, not from me, but from another lady that I interviewed. If that's okay, I'll share that story. So she grew up in Moscow and like had ballerina lessons from like the time she was 5 and had huge talent, became a ballerina. And then when she was a professional ballerina as a grown woman, she like started feeling heavier and heavier, like emotionally, because that ballerina world is actually pretty rough to be in. Like the way she described it is that the trainers, the bosses, almost never give you positive feedback. It's usually always about you're too heavy, this move was not perfect. Like it's so much criticism and so much focus on your weight and tunnel vision. And she got to this place where lots of her colleagues and friends were leaving the ballerina world. They were just quitting their jobs and moving out. And she got to that place where she thought about quitting. And then she did exactly that. She sat down with herself and she prayed, like assuming there is, basically using this technique and asking for wisdom. And what she received as a response was the idea that, hey, you love to dance. Like the dancing itself, you actually absolutely love. And it's who I made you to be. And what you could do instead of leaving is you could bring light into this pretty dark work environment. Like, how could you do that? And she started getting these ideas. Like, she started a podcast interviewing actually not just the ballerinas, because she said what ballerinas do is they just connect to other ballerinas and they have this total tunnel vision on their performance. And she said, I want to create connection and light. I'm going to start interviewing other people in this world, like the costume designer or the audio technician behind the stage or like the theater owner, or, I'm going to interview these people and connect to them and see what's going on. And she made that change. And she also made the change that she just stopped hanging around after the performance, hoping that her boss would say something positive. Like instead, she actually left and walked home and like thought about what did I enjoy? Like, how did it feel to dance? What did I enjoy about it? And so for her, the brave thing was not to quit, it was to stay, but to stay differently. And it was through a connecting with the divine, sitting down, introspection that helped her figure that out and be on a good path.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that story too. I think we can relate with these kind of stories of how it applies to our own life, even though we might not be a ballerina, we're not Russian, it's like, maybe I'm going to try that technique too and journal and see what shows up from that. Thank you for
Yeah.
that, Gina. We're going to do a switch. I want to take it in a little bit of a different direction. I had read about a bus kidnapping story of courage. Can you share with us? Because
This is
I
true.
interviewed another person, if you're listening to this, Jessica Buchanan. It's like episode 103, and it was titled Surviving the Survival. She had been kidnapped for 90 days, and
What?
it was all about her kidnap. And when I read this about you, I was like, oh my God, I have to hear this story about Gina, because kidnapping to me like seems like from another world. Like, what
Yes,
is your story with kidnapping, please?
I agree. That must have been such a one-off situation. I think kidnapping is from another world too. I was maybe 12 or 12, yeah. And I got on the school bus to go to school in Germany, and this man got on. Later, it turns out he had big mental challenges. Like he ended up actually in a mental institution for some time. But yeah, he got on the bus, he had a knife, and he held the knife to the bus driver's throat. And he said, hey, we're not going to go to school. We're going to go where I want to go. And which was to France, which wasn't too far from where I lived. But so the first fascinating thing that happened is, were you on a school bus in Spain growing up? Yes, you were. So in Germany, at least, the cool kids were always in the back and they were kind of bullying the other kids. And so the cool kids were actually completely quiet. They did not stand up, they didn't do anything. The kid that stood up was the kind of overweight, nerdy kid that the cool kids bullied. Like he stood up and he said to the guy, don't do this, which didn't do much. But I am still impressed to this day that he was brave enough to do that. And who stood up was very fascinating to see. And then eventually, I actually ended up like kind of hiding behind the seat and calling the police number from my phone. And this was so weird. I call the police, they pick up, I say, hey, we're in this bus and the bus is kind of being kidnapped. And she said, where are you? What's the zip code? I gave her the zip code and she says, okay, hold on a minute. And she puts me on hold and it's this music while she's transferring me to the local
Oh
police
my
station.
God.
And it just felt so awkward. I just remember how courage in that moment felt so awkward. I'm like, I'm listening to this music. This is so weird. And then I don't even remember them talking to the police, because what ended up happening is that man decided that he wanted the bus driver to just pull over, and he got out, and he then stole a car, drove to Paris, but he was out of the bus, and the bus driver drove us to school. And I actually had a math test that morning. And like everyone, right, the kids that were in the bus, they could decide, do they want to call their parents? Do they want to be picked up and get some hot chocolate at home? Or do they want to go to school? Like it was our choice. And somehow, I don't know why, at 12, I decided, you know what? No, I'm not going to let that guy ruin my math test. I'm going to go and I'm going to get an A, like to show him, you know. And I actually did that. And so what's fascinating to me about that story, I think that's a total one of random example. Like anything we do in our lives that's brave can later serve us so much, because I had this moment then at 30 years old where on a Monday morning I was supposed to lead like a business meeting that had like 300 people on it, and I had to lead it. I had to bring all these different groups together. It's like a masterpiece of doing that. But the night before, I had experienced some massive heartbreak where a relationship that I was hoping would be beautiful, like just ended completely unexpectedly. And I was like shivering. That's like my body's response to heartbreak, you know, and I was feeling all these body symptoms, and I was feeling so down. In the morning of that Monday, I was like, how on earth am I supposed to show up as like my professional self, like in power? Like my heart is shattered. Like I don't have it in me. And somehow that memory came back to me like, hey, when I was 12, I got kidnapped in a bus, and then I went and I got that A in my math test, and I did not let him ruin my day, right? And somehow that memory was what I needed to be like, okay, I'm going to show up to that meeting. And I actually did it, and I did it well. To me, it's less about being in a crazy bus kidnapping story. It's more about when we do a little brave thing, it's not just in that moment that it puts us on a good path. Like this might come back to you 10 years later and enable you then to do something brave. It's like the ripple effects are endless, you know, little brave things we do.
I love this story, because some people could be like, oh, well, that's not that big of a deal or whatever, like it's not a 90-day kidnapping like this
Oh,
other
no.
woman, Jessica Buchanan. But it's these incidents that happen to all of us, whether you got kidnapped for an hour on a bus, or whether something happened at school, your parents got like whatever it is. But what I hear in that story with you, Gina, is your ability to respond. You had a choice. A circumstance happened to all of you kids that were in that bus. And it's how did each kid decide to respond? Like, were they completely petrified and they went home that day? Did they just have the hot chocolate? Did they choose to go do the test? Which for a 12-year-old, I have to commend you, like that's a huge act of bravery, like of just like, no, I'm going to move on. And then it served you later on. But it's such a reminder for all of us listening. How are we responding to the circumstances around us? Because all of you kids went through that exact same circumstance, whether it's a car accident, whether it's a loss of a loved one, whether it's a divorce, whatever it is, a loss, yeah, whatever shows up for you, you have that power of choice in that moment of deciding, am I going to be a victim to the circumstances, or am I going to override it and choose, to respond to the situation versus react to the situation? So I
Yeah.
commend you for that one. And the fact that you were able to also see it, years later when you had to present this meeting and tap into that again and say, okay, I can be a victim and let fear take over, or am I going to respond and just still be brave and act? So I want to go back with this, this responding and bravery. As we wrap up, do you feel that courage, especially after interviewing so many different people too and gathering all these different stories, do you feel confidence comes first or courage comes first?
Oh my gosh, definitely courage first.
Okay.
Definitely. Yeah, first comes a fear or a worry of some sort. And you feel that maybe you have sweaty armpits, sweaty fingertips, you know, however it shows up for you. And there's the thought and it's the fear. And then courage is not just letting that drive you, but to think and respond, like you're saying, right? Respond instead of just letting it go its default way, like figuring out what's my way to respond to this. And that's the part that's courageous, because that means you have to really walk through your fear to come out on the other side in some way. And then the confidence comes afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you for that one. And what about, where can people find you, Gina?
Yes, they can go to wavesandwords.org, like waves like in the ocean and words like we're speaking. And the book with the stories is on there. And I'd love to offer the listeners a 20% discount code, which is B, like the courage to be, Bravo Echo, if they want to hear more of those stories and let that inspire them to take little brave steps themselves.
Thank you for that. And as you know, I like asking my guests when they're on the podcast, what can our listeners do to live a life with more courage?
No, interesting enough, I found like the biggest factor for you to set yourself up to make courageous decisions is to surround yourself with people that either try and be brave themselves and tell you about it, or are willing to brainstorm with you what courage could look like in that situation. Like almost all the stories I heard, there was maybe a girlfriend, a sister, a colleague, or a role model. And it doesn't even have to be a person that's in your life. It could be a book that you're reading, it could be a podcast you're listening to. But surrounding yourself with these stories is like the number one thing.
I
Yeah.
love that. That's great. Thank you for sharing that, Gina. And what I'm getting right now as you're speaking all of this is that you are a great role model for your stepkids, of like
Well,
just
thank you.
studying all this of courage. You are passing that on to them too. So
Thank you.
thank you for
You
doing that research and following your intuition and following your curiosity with it.
Thank you. And I mean, to keep it real, I still am in a victim place also often. Like probably this morning, I was in a victim place about something, but it just feels so much better and so much more alive, when I figure out how to not do that. So I'm still on this journey too. I surround myself with those people. I love listening to your podcast for that reason.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. Isn't it great to be able to just hear other people's stories? Because then it takes a little bit of the heaviness of our own, mind chatter and everything that we keep telling
Yeah.
ourselves. So when you see someone else, that's why I appreciate all your stories that you've been sharing with us today, because you're like, oh, when did I go through something similar? Or maybe I should tap into that. And reminding ourselves that none of us have this, not myself, not you, like even if we're studying this subject, that we're still working our way through it and we have our moments. This is not a one-stop shop, right? It's
Oh,
a journey and we're constantly growing and learning from each other, right?
yeah. Yeah. And the more
Thank
we do it, the more we do build those neural pathways and the more easy it comes, but definitely a path and a journey.
Yeah, thank you so much,
Yeah.
Gina. I so appreciate you coming on and sharing your stories and the people that you've connected with and the discoveries that you made regarding courage. So thank you. Thanks again.
Thanks, Tanya, for the beautiful podcast you built.
Hi there. I have something really cool for you. I want to give you free access to my signature course called Manifesting Abundance, which typically sells for $997. You can check out all the details in the show notes, and all you have to do to gain access is leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, take a snapshot of it, and send it to help.thecouragetobee@gmail.com, and we'll get you set up with access to the course.